Honourable Member for Parramatta.
I direct my question to the Treasurer. I refer the Treasurer to recent public commentary suggesting that the tax system in Australia does not sufficiently tax consumption expenditures. I ask the Treasurer, can he advise the House how Australia's tax mix compares in world terms, and what are the government's intentions in this matter?
The Honourable Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, in the address I gave yesterday to the National Press Club, I made it clear that the ratio of indirect tax to revenue in Australia was 29.8%, compared with an OECD average of 30.3%. Now, that leads any reasonable person to conclude that the weight of taxation on indirect taxation in Australia is at or around the OECD level, and it's certainly worth noting that 6 of the 7 largest OECD countries have lower indirect tax to total tax than does Australia. So the argument which is being put about that Australia has a relatively small base of taxation, indirect taxation, vis-a-vis comparable countries is basically unfounded. It is worth also making the point, as the questioner requires, Mr Speaker, that the government, he asked about the government's intention. The government's intention has been to make certain that the indirect base, the proportion of indirect tax to revenue has not declined over the years, particularly as we've seen a decline in the revenue out of Bass Strait. The former government lived in the salad days of Bass Strait, all that easy, lazy money coming out of those big pools like halibut and kingfish, and they're now finished, or they're in the secondary recovery, and so we have kept the indirect tax base in reasonable fettle. But we don't believe, Mr Speaker, that we should be moving to a consumption tax, because, as I indicated yesterday, a consumption tax now cannot produce enough surplus dollars to cut marginal tax rates. Now, where in the past this was possible, for a number of reasons, particularly in 1985, it's not possible now. It might be worth just adumbrating those reasons. In 1985, the base for a consumption tax had within it what we call restricted goods, and such things as building materials and food and other things, etc., particularly those which are now referred to as business inputs. The argument now, the rationale for a consumption tax is to not tax those things. So naturally, when examining now the base for such a tax, those things have got to be removed. So the base therefore is smaller. The wholesale sales tax base is larger. It's been expanded in these years, in part because of the rundown of Bass Strait and other influences in the excises. And that means that when one looks at the yield of a consumption tax, discounting the wholesale sales tax, there's now a smaller gap than there used to be. And the third reason is that the fiscal yield or dividend is smaller because in 1985 we had to look at the compensation, not just of social security beneficiaries but also of taxpayers by shifting tax thresholds, compensating the then existing tax base. But the then existing tax base was very narrow with high marginal rates. It's now a much broader base by virtue of capital gains, fringe benefits, substantiation, the prescribed payment system, audits, etc. So now the costs of compensating the tax base or taxpayers is much greater because more income has been brought to tax and therefore more income has to be compensated. Now all of these things mean that there's now not the surplus of funds available to cut income tax rates, and therefore the savings argument on which most of the renewed interest in a consumption tax has been built falls apart because the savers are basically people on higher incomes. And so if the system doesn't yield new fresh money to cut the tax rates at the top end of the tax system, the savings point of course breaks down. And the other point that I think a lot of the proponents of the consumption tax have forgotten is that one has to compensate taxpayers for more than that which they spend on consumption. One has to also compensate them for that which they save, that is, for future consumption. So you're not simply giving back that which the consumption tax yields, you've got to give back more because one has to return the tax on the savings as well. Now, These are all the reasons, probably, Mr Speaker, that the opposition is now trying to weakly move back away from their hairy-chested commitment, ill-thought-through, ill-conceived, hairy-chested commitment to a consumption tax of a week or two ago. Instead of sitting down and saying we've taken a defeat and the public didn't buy our shonky wages policy, the fact that we had, as the Minister for Finance said, a $7 billion set of unfunded commitments, we went to an election without a health policy, a monetary policy which would grind the economy into the dust to cut inflation, an abolition of the capital gains tax which, if they were elected to office, would now have an 8-year backdating. Instead of focusing on those things, on day one, a party without ideas, on day one of the election of the new leader, they were embracing the consumption tax to suggest that they're the people with the ideas, they're the ones that are going to put the big one on the agenda. And now they have to face some of the harsh realities of the arithmetic. And what did we see last night? On the Late Line program, we saw the Leader of the Opposition say these things. I've only suggested it should be put on the agenda for review. See, only, small word, big meaning. Then he says, it's worth reviewing that measure, not in any sense that it's a panacea in its own right, because it isn't. Another one. The only point I can see is that over the last 10 or 12 years that this tax has been on the agenda for public debate and scope for significant tax cuts has been reduced. So already moving back from the tax cut capacity. Question comes, but the savings argument in favour of consumption tax is no longer a strong argument. The answer from the Leader of the Opposition, well, it's an argument, but it's not, you know, it does have and can have some significant effect on savings. But it's not as strong an argument as it was several years ago. I agree that the argument is less strong. And then finally he says, it's not the panacea for savings that people argue that it is. So we're starting to see at least some reasonable detection of some movement away. Now let me just tell you this. You embraced the former Leader of the Opposition. Order. The former Leader of the Opposition embraced the inflation adjustment proposal and then dropped it, and was let off by the media on the basis that he was an economically illiterate. But don't think you'll wriggle off this particular hook and be given the same generous treatment.